let's officially start this workshop today. It's a little workshop. It's called How to Phrase Respectful Code Review Feedback. And I guess that most of you are really here because you are on my mailing list, because you are coming from my blog, you read maybe an article of mine or something like that. If you got it from a friend or something like that, also let me know so that I know. But I assume that most of you actually are somehow connected with me via my emails that I send every week. And so I guess you know a little bit of my journey as well. Okay, so I'm actually working for Microsoft. I have been with Microsoft since 2013. And I first was there a researcher. So I joined them in thank you, Tyler. I joined there in the UK office in Cambridge, and I worked already with teams in Seattle at that point. But then later on, only a few months later, I joined actually in Redmond. So I moved to the States, and I worked there with all major product teams. I worked with Office, with Windows, with Visual Studio, with Exchange. And I helped them with many different aspects of their engineering lifecycle. And our team owned the build system. So we did distributed. So I actually came out from Microsoft Research at that time. Distributed cached builds weren't something that you could just get out of the box. So we provided that system with all the algorithms behind, so that, for example, Windows could be built instead of within days or within hours. And we did that by caching, for example, parts of the build graph that haven't changed, and we could prove that parts of that haven't changed, and also by distributing the workload. And another area was code review. So our team, it's called 1ES, One Engineering System Team, actually owns also the internal code review tool, and now has more and more to do with, for example, with GitHub code reviews and things like that. And so I worked on build, on test, but also on code reviews. And I did several studies actually with the different teams or across Microsoft. And we looked at how can we make this practice more beneficial, because engineers, as you will probably know, spend quite a significant amount of time on code reviews. So several years ago, there was a study, and that study showed that on average, people spend over 6 hours per week. And that has been going up drastically since then. But even 6 hours is, well, if you imagine engineering life cycles, right, it's already a substantial investment into that practice. So we want to get that practice right, and really to understand, what makes teams efficient, and what makes them really benefit from the code reviews, and what hinders their practice. And yeah, so that's how everything started. So within the last year, I started more and more to share what I researched and my insights and my experience with the outside world through blogs. And so I gave several code review workshops, but they have been all on site. And so this today is the first attempt in an online review workshop. It's a little, a little sneak peek, and I'm really happy that you are here today. And I hope that you can give me a little bit feedback, how you liked it, if the topics are interesting to you, and to see how that works. And you will see more of those little online workshops over the next year, I guess. So what do I do in the normal workshops? So the workshops that I do with the companies, there are several pillars, I would call them, or sessions, right? And they are mostly about feedback. So how to give respectful code review feedback. That's what we also covered today. So code reviews. I'm assuming every one of you knows about code reviews, but just to give a really slight introduction, code reviews can come in all kinds and forms, right? It could be just over the shoulder, that you're walking towards your colleague and you're looking over the shoulder and looking at some code together. That's already a code review. And there are these really formal inspections where, there's a meeting, you have an inspection list, and normally that's a post-development step. So after you develop a feature, or even a lifestyle, more in a waterfall setting, you would sit down and review that code. Can be also for companies that need more security security obligations, that have more security obligations, right? Nowadays, I think most of the companies have tool-based code reviews. So you have either your code review tool, or you have, for example, GitHub or GitLab and or a Bitbucket or whatnot. And somehow in a pull request, a merge request, or somehow in this development life cycle, there is a stage that you review the code of others, and there is some tooling involved that you send some notifications, or in open source, it's mailing lists, right? So it comes in very different forms, but it's very often tool-based, so that you're having written communications. You're not, next to each other, pair programming, but you have written communication. And I think that's also one of the things what we will discuss today, why it's difficult to give good feedback, because it's not personal, it's written. There is another layer of complexity to it. So what are the benefits? I'm really quickly going over it, but it's a lot of it is readable code. It's maintaining norms, right? Having consistent styles, having consistent designs, having adequate tests, things like that. So it's about the code base itself, and that you keep the code base in a good status, in a good quality. It's also a little bit about gatekeeping. I mean, gatekeeping is often used in a very negative, it has a negative connotation to it. But what I mean with it is that it prevents arbitrary code to be committed, and there's also a part of it for security. I wouldn't say that's a large part of it, because it can be easily circumvented and so on. But in larger organizations, like for example for Google or Microsoft, that's definitely one aspect why you do code reviews. It's accident prevention. I'm really sorry that I'm coughing today, but there is no way around that. So it's accident prevention. So it's really finding bugs, defects, ensuring high quality code. And even though people like to name that as one of the main primary goals, it shouldn't be the primary goal. Because we are actually, as humans, we are not good in finding bugs. We are not good in finding defects. So if that's your primary goal, you should really invest in testing. You shouldn't invest in code reviews. Having said that, code reviews do find bugs. There are around 15% of the issues are related to bugs. So it's substantial, nevertheless, right? You don't want these 15% of the bugs or potential bugs in your code. It's education, and I think that's, maybe you should have put that as the first thing, because I think one of the real benefits of code reviews is education. It's mentoring, learning, and knowledge dissemination. So suddenly it's not one developer in a silo that knows about his or her code, but it's a team that also knows a little bit what's going on, what is developed, why have certain decisions been made. And that's really, really powerful. You also learn from your peers. So if I see how somebody else is coding something, and I haven't seen this API call, or I haven't seen that pattern, you can learn a lot. And also getting the feedback, right, can help a lot. And finally, it's tracing and tracking. So because you are using those tooling, if you're not just doing it over the shoulder, you're using a tooling, you have some ability to go back and actually say, well, what happened there? Why did we do that? Why did we decide on that? So there is some tracking and tracing ability to it. And I see that more and more tools really take that to a next level. So I think we will see over the next few years that will become even richer. That's what I predict. So you will see more of those code review information also within your IDE, and you will have access to it, with AI and things like that. It will be better and better that we really have context relevant information available. So I think that will be really rich. Right now we are not there yet, but you can at least go and see, what happened for some of the code reviews. So what to look for in code. I really go quickly over that because I really want to focus on the phrasing, but I think it's relevant for you as well. So I recommend to use a checklist. at least for learning and training. So there were several studies that actually showed that code reviewers that used checklists were outperforming code reviewers who didn't. But there were also studies that showed that especially beginners really benefit from a checklist. But even if you're not a beginner, going back to a checklist, looking at it from time to time and understanding if, you know, what you're looking for is you don't forget anything, and maybe also educating yourself, right? So I will show some of the areas that a code review list can be used for. And I think some of the areas we are probably not experts, we are not specialists. I mean, there's so much to know, and there's so much we can learn more and more, right, and get better. So I think a checklist for some specific areas that you are not that well versed, right, make really sense to look and learn what should you actually look for, right? So what are some of those things? Well, first of all, implementation. I think we all start with that, right? We open the thing and we look at the implementation, and what does this mean? Well, how does the code look like? But then you also look like logic errors and bugs. Do you think that, you know, there's some edge cases that somebody has forgotten? Are there some bugs? How about error handling and logging, right? Is that done correctly? Usability and accessibility. I mean, that's one area I think that many of us can improve. The same for testing and testability. Is the code that you just got for doing the code review, is that testable? Is it tested enough? And performance, obviously important. Dependencies, have there been any dependencies introduced that, you know, are unwanted? Security and data privacy, I think again here I give special workshops just for this topic, because it's, again, you know, you're opening a book up. How can you look, and if you have some security issues, probably you have a security expert looking over it, but maybe you don't have one in your company. So really educating yourself in that area can help you very much as well. Readability, and then last, expert opinion. And what I would suggest for some code review checklist like that is, I have one, I can send you that one if you want. I send the whole participant group my checklist. It's more detailed what you see right here, and I really recommend that from time to time. I don't know what's your schedule, or, you know, what's really fitting to you. Maybe it's once a week, or maybe it's at the beginning it's more and then it's getting less. Familiarize yourself with those questions. Try to find, you know, issues in that, and just learn it yourself. And I think you can also take that checklist and look through your own code before sending it out for review, because that's really important, that you reduce the burden of the reviewer. You want to do that for your colleagues, and you will be happy if your colleagues do that, right? So you can use this code review checklist not only to go through the code of others, but you can use it to go through your own code. And as I said, I mean, security, data privacy, usability, accessibility, I think things like that, we can always learn more. And you know, take once a month and just look up some of those things. So if you want, this is from checklist, so I will send you that. Yeah, great. Yeah, I will send you all of that. All of you, I will send that. I'm not going to go through each of those things, but I just want to give you some idea of what such a checklist looks like and what you would look for. So for example, implementation. So if you say, I want to inspect the code now for the implementations, you would ask yourself, does this code change do what it's supposed to do? And for that, you will obviously look at the description, for example, if there is some code review description, or maybe there's a ticket associated with it. A good question is also, can the solution be simplified? Does this change add some unwanted compile time or runtime dependencies? A lot of the questions will be about frameworks, APIs, libraries. So are the right ones used? Are they used in the right way, right? Is the code at the right abstraction level? Is the code modular enough? Those are all really relevant questions. Would you have solved the problem in a different, but substantially different, better way, right? So not just there are many solutions to one problem, but if you have an alternative solution, it's really important that it's better in one respect, right? Yeah, so logic errors, I'm just skipping a little bit over that so that we are not running out of time. Testing performance, right? I mean, performance is really important as well. Security and data privacy. And this is really just a smaller version of what you can actually look for: security and data privacy. So if you are interested in that, I would suggest you to look at the Open Web application security standards. If you want, I can send you a link as well in the email that I send you after that workshop, because there is really a lot of how to look through changes to really make sure that they are adhering to security standards and data privacy. Well, readability is a very important topic as well in the code review space. So was this code easy to understand? I think sometimes we have to ask ourselves, but I think this is more an implicit thing. If I don't understand it, you will understand that you don't understand it. You don't have to nitpick around. If you read through the code and you think it's actually flowing well, why change it, right? But if there are things that are confusing, then think about why and how can they be improved, right? Are the methods too big? Can it be improved by smaller methods? Should be maybe the functions or the variables have a different name, right? The right folder and package structure, all things like that. And expert opinion. So as a reviewer and also as a code change author, you should ask yourself, should a person, an expert, look over that? So for example, if you change something for login or authentication, you probably want somebody with security, a better security understanding. Maybe you're this person, then it's okay. But maybe you have somebody on your team that could, give a second thought just for that. And what I also like is that sometimes people annotate their own code changes with questions that they have. And I think this list can also be used nicely, that you go over your own code and make some annotations where you really want feedback. So be the leader of your own code review. I think it's really important that if you have code reviews, that you don't feel that they just happen to you, but you're in control. You can actually ask for feedback and say, can you give me some advice here, and really learn and grow through code reviews. So now that I went through all those, the question is, what do developers actually perceive as valuable? Is all of that valuable? Should I go through all of that all the time? And well, we did a study at Microsoft, so it was a rather large study. And first of all, I really like, when I do research, I do combined research. So I do qualitative and quantitative research. If that doesn't say anything to you, it's okay. What this means is that interviews, for example, where you have one-on-one conversation, where you just get a little bit more, it's not really evidence, it's more a feeling of something, an understanding. You don't have the quantity, you don't have like 1,000 developers, but you have like 20 or 25 developers, and you try to really understand what are they telling you. And then you complement that with, for example, quantitative data. That could be from a survey, but in that case, what we did, we were actually building a recommender system, and the AI-infused system that could predict whether or not code review was valuable, and then correlate that, so statistically correlate that to different circumstances. So to really understand, when we saw in code reviews, we were actually able to predict very well whether or not a comment was valuable or not. And then we could take that information, run it over millions of comments, and correlate that, for example, with the circumstances. So for example, people that just joined the team versus people that have been on the team for longer than a year. Do we see differences in how valuable their feedback is? Or we also did that for files, for example. So do people in general, right, it's now very generalized, do developers at Microsoft give more valuable feedback on code, like for example C# code, than on C code, or on YAML files, so actually deployment files and things like that. And we could see differences there. For example, especially deployment related issues are we didn't see so much value in the code review feedback. And then we can dig deeper again why that actually happens. But yeah, so this is a study that we did. And the idea that we wanted to get is, what do developers perceive as valuable feedback? And so we classified the different comments, for example, in categories. Well, comments about, the first one that you see here over there is documentation. Then you see UX and design, organization, solution approaches, resources. And then we also asked them whether or not the thing is useful or not useful. And so it turns out that feedback about functional defects, bugs, logical errors, everybody thinks that's really useful, right? So if I get that back from my code review, then the code review really made sense, and that's valuable feedback. Missing validations and corner cases is also valuable feedback. Best practices in coding convention, valuable feedbacks. API usage and design patterns, again, valuable feedback. So if you want to give valuable feedback, this is something you should concentrate on. What we see right here is, again, what I said at the beginning, people are associating code reviews very often with finding defects and improving the solutions. And again, as a consequence, if you get feedback like that back, you also find that valuable. There were other issues, like, for example, documentations, feedback about coding styles, spelling mistakes, and coding convention. They were valuable, but they came with the but. So developers found them valuable, but there is this line that you can pass, and then it starts to be nitpicking, right? If you, for example, have the second indentation problem, and you say, well, again, you know, there's a spacing missing, and your code review is all over that. Yeah, that can be annoying, and then this valuable becomes to not that valuable, right? What's really important here, automation helps. So if you have, for example, a linter, so a system that can detect things like that automatically, I would really recommend doing that, so that the human do not have to look at other things. And it's also really important that you make your team aware that solving problems with the documentation, solving spelling mistakes, you know, having the right coding styles, they might feel like nitpicking, but they're really, really valuable in the end over a long time. It's a little bit this broken window theory, if you have heard of that. So if you have problems in your code base, they are creeping in little by little, but over the time it really becomes ununderstandable and unmaintainable, and you get more and more sloppy over time. So another thing, and I think that's important as well, that they discussed were no-goes. So what shouldn't you discuss in a code review? And this were, for example, alternative implementations without obvious benefits. So nobody likes to be said, well, I would have done this different, and I want you to change that. I want you to change it to this and that. And you don't see a performance improvement. You don't see a readability improvement, right? There is no substantial improvement. It's just different. Don't give feedback like that. Another thing, existing technical depth or planning in future work do not belong in the code review. Don't say you have to change this over there if that's not part of the code change, right? So you shouldn't introduce new technical debt, but if this technical debt has already been in that file before, it's not really something that you would like to discuss in code reviews. You could, for example, make a comment and say, well, this is technical debt. We should look at that. I created a ticket for, the next sprint, but don't block a code review because of existing issues or things that happen in the future. Another thing, asking questions merely to understand the implementation was rated by the developers at Microsoft as not useful. So for example, if there is a reviewer and this reviewer just annotates the hell out of the code review and ask questions without really helping anything to improve the code, it's not seen as valuable. And I think you can do that, but then you should clearly mark a code review, for example, as a teaching tool right now. So let's say this is not a normal code review cycle, but right now we use these code reviews for onboarding, a new team member, or for, getting another colleague acquainted, or with the code. So stay on topic is actually the message. I'm not gonna go through that because I'm running out of time, but there's an article that I wrote about how to give valuable feedback, and you can look through that. One of the points that I want to talk today again is, did I communicate in a respectful way? Because now we looked at what issues should we look at, but how do we communicate that? And that's really, really important. Your feedback can be so valuable and so beneficial for the team, but if you just cannot bring your message across, it's not good, right? And it has to do with the psychology of receiving feedback. So it's just, if we get feedback, it's very, very often seen as criticism, even though we want to see it as critique. There is this slight change. But to really have it as a critique, not a criticism, and as constructive feedback, we have to really work, both sides have to work, the person that gives the feedback and the person that receives the feedback. Today we are focusing more on the giving end. So if we give feedback, what can we do to ease the burden for the receiver? And why is that important? Well, the amygdala is a part of our brain. It's actually called the lizard brain, and it reacts to threat. You definitely have heard of it. And what it triggers is the flight, fight, or freeze mode, right? So if I hear feedback that I feel criticizes myself, my belief, something, that I'm invested in, like my code, I've worked, let's say 2 weeks or a week really hard on that code, and I really tried my best, and then somebody comes and says, well, that's bullshit, right? That stinks, and that triggers my amygdala, and that triggers that I either fight, I flight, or I freeze. But what it doesn't do, it doesn't create nice relationships between my peers. I feel attacked. And so the question is, what can we do? Well, there are conflicts happening in code reviews. No doubt, there should be also. I mean, in our whole life, there should be conflict. And there are strategies to work with them. I'm not going to go into that in that code review workshop today, but that's one of the topics that I normally look at. But how do we phrase code review that it's really respectful, that we don't trigger the amygdala of the person that gets the feedback that much, right? And it's not that easy. And it's not that easy because even written communication makes it even harder for us, because the receiver must interpret the message, and they don't see, they don't see you move, they don't see your body language, they don't see your facial expressions, they don't hear your tone. So one of the things why I ask at the beginning, if you see my video, is because it's just much more richer. Even though you can just listen to me talking, if you see my body language, it gives you much more clues. They are really implicit and they are small, and maybe you think, well, I wouldn't have to see McKayla giving this talk, right? It's true, you wouldn't have to see me, but at least you hear me, which already helps. But if you don't see me, if you don't hear me, right, you don't see my facial expression, don't see my body language, then this can easily go wrong. And the problem is that with miscommunication or written communication, we are often on a negative side. Studies show that, right? So if you give feedback, err on the side of caution. Really be careful about your written communication. So there were several studies, and one of them was, for example, by Kruger, and they made a study about detecting sarcasm. And so they had 2 different groups, and they had to look through different sarcastic statements. And then they had to select some of the sarcastic statements where they think the receiver will definitely understand that this is sarcasm. This isn't serious. This is sarcasm, right? This is a sarcastic statement. And they had also to say, well, from those 10 messages that I got, how many do I think the other person will definitely understand? And for both groups, the rates were sort of the same. It was around 75 and 77.9%. So they said, well, almost 80% will definitely understand. So almost 80% of the messages will definitely be detected as sarcasm. But then they delivered the messages in two different channels. One was via voice and the other was via email. And the funny thing is that during voice, the actual detection rate, so that the people could say in a correct way whether or not that was now sarcasm or not, were 73%. So it's quite close to what you predicted that they will be able to detect and what they actually detected. But via email, it looked completely different. Only 56% of the people were able to detect whether or not the statement is sarcastic or not. And what that means, I mean, now you think 56 maybe is not that low, but it's just 6% higher than chance, right? So if you just would put, take a straw, it would be almost the same, right? What I want to say with that is that it's really hard for people to detect sarcasm and understand written communication. I'm going over this study a little bit faster because I'm running out of time and I really want to go through the statements with you. What's really important is always assume miscommunication over malice. So if you receive some feedback in a written form, the first thing that you should have, turn off your amygdala, think, okay, I now feel I'm threatened, calm down, let it cool down, and then think, well, probably the person just has miscommunicated. It wasn't malice that they sent me something, right? And then we are already by the first rule. So for your code review feedback that you give, that it's respectful and doesn't trigger the amygdala that much, be humble and be kind. And that means don't expect that you know everything. Don't expect that you are the expert for everything. And always think about how to be a kind person, right? So I think this is really the main rule. If you take away something from this workshop, then take away that message. Try to be humble and be kind. The next thing that I always say is, if you start with a code review, think about how can I add value? So it's not about you, showing off or being able to at least find 3 errors so that you participated or something. But think about how can I add value? How can I help that person, that delivered that code? So, and now we are really, this is our, that's true. I just saw the chat. On a good environment, sarcasm will always be avoided. Yes, I say, and that's one of the rules that I will come to later. Code reviews and all of that isn't a place to be sarcastic, to have sarcasm. There is nothing good coming out of that, right, in such a setting. So, but the first rule that I wanted to start with is, do not make demands, rather ask questions. And why shouldn't you demand something? Well, because the code author knows a lot about the code. I mean, they wrote it, and you should always assume that they are competent, assume competence. And you aren't always right. And there are different perspectives. As I said before, there could be a very valid different solution to a problem, but it doesn't mean that this has to be the way that it's implemented, right? And always remember that a lot of the practices, the best practices, even though they are done, by large teams, large organizations, they are written in many books. Most of them are really opinionated guidelines. It's not a fact. It's not right or wrong. It's a best practice. So you can ask, if the person agrees that you should change that, but you shouldn't demand. And here's one of the examples. This variable should have the name user ID. This is a demand, right? And what you could do instead, you could ask, what do you think about the name user ID for this variable? It's an easy way to reformulate that question. Another one is, pull these translations into a constant file. I mean, on one hand, you might say, well, there's nothing wrong with it. But on the other hand, maybe there are better approaches, right? So don't just demand that somebody does that. You could say, why didn't, oh yeah, sorry, this is red again. Why didn't, so now you think, okay, McKayla said I should make a question out of that. So I go and say, why didn't you just pull this translation into a constant file? Yeah, it's a question, you are right. but that's not the kind of question that you should ask, right? It's again not humble, and it's not kind. It's sarcastic again, right? Or it's misleading. It's not really a question. It's stating the obvious that you want them to do. A rhetorical question, more or less. So a better way to phrase that would be, what do you think about pulling these translations into a content file? There are a lot, and separate file might make sense at this point. Okay, so there is, first of all, a question. Second, there's a little bit more meat to it, right? So why would you do that? Well, because there are a lot. This is somehow a statement about an observation that you made. By the way, all those code review feedbacks that we go through are real feedbacks that I researched on the internet, and I wanted to show you because I think it's nicer than just me making up stuff. So you introduced a lot of translation calls for feature X in this file. It might make sense to create a separate file devoted to feature X constants. This is now not a question, right? So it's somehow the same context, but it's not a question anymore. You're saying, but you say it, I would say, in a quite soft way. It might make sense to create a separate file devoted to feature X constant. So you're not demanding, you're making a suggestion. And I think that's perfectly fine if you do that. You don't always have to ask, can you, would you, something like that. It's a different way to do it. But there's another rule. Make it about the code, not the person. So avoid your, and focus on the code and the architecture, because you messages lead to justifications, rejections, and defensive stance. So if you say, when we look back, you introduced a lot of translation calls for this feature in this file, then it's about you, right? It's about that person. That person did something wrong. Maybe that person wasn't even the code author for that, right? So, but in any way, if you say that, it will trigger somehow the amygdala much more than if you would say this code has a lot of translation calls for feature X. So there's a little bit a change. This code has a lot, or this code doesn't, do this or that. And in addition, what I changed here is this would improve maintainability and readability, because it gives a reason. So people understand not only why you asked that and the observation that you made, but also what's the reason behind it. And that would be, for example, improving maintainability and readability. Another example really about the person is, you requested the service multiple times, which is inefficient. Well, better would be, this code is requesting the service multiple times, which is inefficient. The same goes for iMessages. So use iMessages, own your feedback. And that's really important. Own your feedback, your beliefs, your thought. It's what you think. First of all, the other person cannot really argue about that, because it's what you feel. For me, this is. It also doesn't make it a generalization. So it's not for everybody that this code isn't readable. It's for you. You find it hard to understand. So this is a really bad example. You are writing cryptic code. So everything that you can do wrong goes wrong in that statement. But you could say, it's hard for me to grasp what's going on in this code. This is really a statement about you, and that it's hard for you to understand. I already said that, so it's really good to give a little bit guidance. So it's not only share the observation and tell the author, that's wrong, but also tell them what should be improved. You don't have to write their solutions, and you shouldn't. Most of the time, they know more about everything else. So maybe they come up with the better solutions, but give them clues, give them guidance, what you actually thought about it. So it's hard for me to grasp what's going on in this code. If you just say that, so now what should the person do? Well, could you break that up and add a comment? As I said, explain the reason. I think it's really important to explain the reason. So instead of saying, please use array helper, get value method here, you could say, I suggest use array helper, get value method here, because its error handling capabilities instead of accessing the value directly. Well, there's also the observation, impact, and request rule. So first of all, say something. what you saw. This should be observation. This method has 100 lines, right? That's sort of a fact. It's a neutral way. Say the impact. This makes it hard for me, so it's again with iMessage, to grasp the essential logic of this method. And then third, have the request. So what do you suggest that the person does? I suggest extracting the low-level details into substring and give them expressive names. I would even add, what do you think about that? So that it's an invite for communication, a collaboration, and eye-to-eye discussion with that person. With all of those examples, I have many more examples, but with all of those examples, I feel it's really important that you are still generous and authentic. So don't ask for something that you don't feel that you have to ask a question, right? So having can you please, would you do, blah, blah, blah. People sense that it's insincere. So you don't have to always ask a question. And if you think you know a better approach, I think you can say that, but just think about how you phrase it and be open to the possibility that the person has a better idea, or learn something else, and be open for this discussion, I think. But stay sincere to yourself. I'm just going over that. So no sarcasm. Yeah, I talked about that. It's really important. This is, for example, sarcasm. Could we possibly use this helpful utility that already does that for us, which our dear teammate Sarah built? I hate this message. It was actually in one of the blog posts, and it was meant as a really helpful, very kind code review feedback. But I just, thought this is so sarcastic. But this again shows that, how it's perceived on the other end really depends on the person that perceives the message. So we have to be careful. And again, I would try to see it as miscommunication and not malice. But yeah, I have a whole blog post on that. So if you want to go into more detail, have a look. Do not teach during code reviews. So there is a lot of advice out there that goes into code reviews and ask people to just trigger questions. And again, this for me, it isn't really sincere. If you look through this code and you see, something is wrong, for example, you don't find it readable and you would like that they change the names, don't just go and say, oh, I'm not sure if I understand the whole idea, but could you explain this method to me? And then, the other person has to do yada, 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 it does this and that, and they really think you didn't understand. And then you say, oh, now I understand, but could you change the function name? I think that's, first of all, it's not sincere. You're playing a teacher, trying, the reason why people suggest that is because they want to teach the other person, and the other person should find the problem on their own and things like that. Well, normally code reviews aren't a teaching environment. There are sometimes, that you really say explicitly, this is now for teaching, but they have different purposes, and then it's collaboration between different colleagues, and one person knows maybe something more about something else, and learn from each other, but learn in a very equal way, I would say. So context is key. This goes back to this teaching, right? There are circumstances, new hires, that you might say, well, right now for that person, code reviews works a little bit different. I go and explain much more, right? Or they can ask different questions, but then it's in a different context. The same with good friends. Maybe you can have very different code review feedback. Maybe you don't have to put so much effort to convey the message because they understand, even written, very well how you meant that. But for a colleague, even if you know that very well, I don't think you should assume that. So the summary is, use iMessages, talk about the code, not the coder, be careful with we. Do not demand, rather ask questions, and context is key, no sarcasm. I will send you that slide, I think. So this is the end of this first online trial workshop. There will be my first real online workshop in January. I hope you will be there, you will be part of that. If you want to give me feedback about this first workshop, I would be really happy if you can send it my way. Well, send it to McKayla at michaelagreiler.com. And if you found this workshop really useful, I would really be happy if you sent me a testimonial. It's just 1-2 sentences about, what was valuable for you in that workshop. That would help me tremendously. So thank you for being part of that first online workshop. And I hope to see you in January.